Flight crew gets strange. Feeling about boy, sees his feet, and tells pilot to land the plane. Here's a gripping introduction for your YouTube story. The flight had been smooth so far. Just another routine trip in the skies. Passengers were settling in, some dozing off, others watching movies or flipping through magazines. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, a constant reminder that they were miles above the world. But for the flight attendants working that shift, something felt off. It wasn't the turbulence. They'd handled that plenty of times. It wasn't a technical issue with the plane. No, it was something much stranger. It started with the boy. He was seated toward the back, close to the restroom, alone. That in itself wasn't entirely odd. Sometimes kids flew by themselves, but something about him wasn't right. He barely moved, barely made a sound. Most kids traveling alone were either chatty, nervous, or lost in their tablets. This boy, though, he just sat there, staring at nothing, his hands in his lap, as if he was afraid to make a wrong move. The flight attendants exchanged glances, their instincts kicking in. They had seen all kinds of travelers, but this one sent a shiver down their spines. One of them, a veteran in the airline industry, decided to approach him. She knelt beside his seat, giving him a warm smile. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said, gently. "Are you okay? Can I get you anything?" The boy flinched, just slightly, but enough for her to notice. He slowly turned his head, meeting her eyes for the briefest second, before dropping his gaze back to his lap. His fingers twisted, together, anxious, unsure. Something wasn't right. She tried again. "Are you flying alone? Who's picking you up when we land?" A pause. Then barely above a whisper, he muttered, I don't know." That was all he said. The flight attendant's stomach tightened. Something was wrong here. The boy's body language screamed discomfort, fear even. She glanced around, trying to see if anyone nearby was watching him too closely. Someone who might be responsible for him. No one seemed to be paying him any special attention. Then she noticed his feet. Her breath caught in her throat. His shoes were far too big for him, and worse, his ankles, the small bit of skin she could see between the loose pant cuffs and the oversized sneakers, were bruised, dark, uneven marks wrapped around them, like something had been tied there too tightly. Chill ran down her spine. She slowly stood up, heart pounding. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a nervous kid on a flight. Something was terribly wrong. She turned, walking briskly toward the lead flight attendant, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to alert the pilot. Now." The flight crew quickly huddled together, whispering as they stole glances at the boy. The decision was made in seconds. The pilot had to know. A message was sent up to the cockpit, and within minutes, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. Low and serious, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are making an unexpected landing due to a potential security concern. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions." The passengers murmured in confusion, some glancing out the windows, others shifting in their seats, trying to understand what was happening. But in the back of the plane, the boy's hands had tightened into fists. He knew the crew had figured something out. The plane began its descent, faster than usual, straight toward the nearest airport. The tension in the cabin was thick, unspoken questions hanging in the air. And when the wheels finally touched down and the doors opened, no one was prepared for what happened next. As law enforcement stormed onto the aircraft, heading straight for the boys' row, the entire plane fell silent. Passengers watched, some holding their breath, as officers carefully but firmly asked him to stand. And then, the moment that would shock everyone. As the boy hesitated, as the officers gently urged him up, a shadow loomed in the aisle. A man, seated just a few rows ahead, suddenly stood, his face twisted in anger. "What are you doing?" he demanded, voice sharp, dangerous. The entire crew went stiff. Passengers gasped, and in that instant, the flight attendants realized this was far from over. The moment the man stood up, a cold wave of tension spread through the cabin. His voice, sharp and demanding, cut through the quiet hum of the plane, sending a ripple of unease through the passengers. The flight attendants locked eyes, their instincts screaming at them. This was not a coincidence. The boy shrank in his seat, his small fingers gripping the armrests. His breathing grew quick and shallow, his shoulders stiff. The officers, who had just stepped onto the plane, immediately turned their attention to the man, their expressions unreadable, but alert. I said, "What are you doing?" The man's voice was louder now, his hands clenching into fists. His eyes darted toward the boy, dark, unreadable. One of the officers, a tall man with a calm but firm presence, took a slow step forward. "Sir, please remain seated." The man didn't move. His jaw was tight, his entire body tense like a coiled spring. "That's my nephew," he said, forcing a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "He's just scared. We're traveling together. What's the problem here?" The flight crew knew something was off. If he was the boy's guardian, why hadn't he spoken up earlier? Why had the boy looked so terrified when they approached? And those bruises, no one could ignore those. The lead flight attendant, heart pounding in her chest, glanced at the officers. They had the same look in their eyes, doubt. The officer kept his voice steady. "We just need to ask him a few questions. If you're his guardian, you'll understand." The man's fingers twitched. "You don't need to do that. He's just shy." But as he spoke, the boy did something no one expected. He slowly turned his head and looked up at the officer. For the first time, his eyes were full of something different. Not just fear, but desperation. He barely moved his lips, but the words that came out sent a chill down the flight attendant's spine. "Please don't let him take me." The officer didn't hesitate. "Sir, sit down. Now." The entire plane seemed to hold its breath. The man's face turned red, his hands shaking slightly at his sides. He looked around, realizing all eyes were on him. The tension stretched, thick between them, each second feeling heavier than the last. The officer signaled to his team. In an instant, another officer stepped forward, blocking the aisle. "Sir, step back." The man's nostrils flared, his chest rising and falling in quick bursts. But then, almost too suddenly, he raised his hands and exhaled, forcing a grin. All right, no need to cause a scene." But it was already too late for that. The officers moved fast. As soon as they reached for the boy, the man lunged, his movements swift, almost rehearsed. He reached out, fingers grasping for the boy's wrist. But the officer closest to him reacted even faster. In seconds, the man was pinned against the seat, his face pressed against the headrest. As passengers gasped in shock, the boy flinched at the commotion, but the flight attendant was already kneeling beside him, whispering gently, "It's okay, you're safe now." Tears welled in the boy's eyes, but he didn't cry. He just stared ahead, frozen, as the officers tightened their grip on the man. As he was pulled up, his voice turned cold. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed at the officers. "You're making a big mistake." But the look in his eyes wasn't fear. It was something worse, a quiet, calculated anger. The flight attendant turned back to the boy. "Sweetheart," she said softly. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated before whispering, "Ethan." She smiled, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ethan, you're doing great. We're going to take care of you, okay?" The plane was eerily silent as the officers escorted the man down the aisle. He didn't struggle anymore, but his head was held high, his jaw set. As he disappeared from sight, the whispers among the passengers began. The flight attendant squeezed Ethan's hand. "Is he really your uncle?" Ethan shook his head. "No." Her breath caught in her throat. The officers, who had been waiting for this answer, exchanged glances. The lead officer knelt beside Ethan. "Do you know him?" The boy hesitated, then gave the smallest shake of his head. "He told me to say I was his nephew. He said if I didn't..." His voice broke, and he swallowed hard. "He said bad things would happen." The officer's face remained calm, but his eyes darkened. This was more than just a misunderstanding. The flight attendant's hands trembled slightly as she reached for Ethan's. "You are so brave," she whispered. "We're going to make sure you're safe, okay?" The officer nodded, his voice gentle but firm. "Ethan, we need to know, where were you before this flight? How did you get here?" Ethan's lips pressed together. He hesitated, his small fingers gripping the armrest, like he was bracing himself. Finally, he whispered something so quietly that they almost didn't hear him. "The airport. A man brought me there. He told me to wait." The officer frowned. "Not the man on the plane." Ethan shook his head. "A different man." The realization hit the flight crew at once. This wasn't just one person. This was something much, much bigger. The officer stood, pulling out his radio. "We need to alert authorities at the airport immediately," he said, voice clipped. "There may be more involved." The flight attendant's stomach twisted. This was no accident, no coincidence. Ethan hadn't just ended up on this flight by mistake. Someone had planned this, and as the plane sat motionless on the runway, with police lights flashing outside the windows, one thought loomed over them all. Whoever had put Ethan on that plane was still out there, and they would be looking for him. The weight of the situation settled over the cabin like a thick fog. The realization that Ethan wasn't just a lost child, but a victim of something much larger, sent a shiver down the flight attendant's spine. The officers moved quickly, speaking in low, urgent tones into their radios. Outside the plane, flashing police lights painted the tarmac in streaks of red and blue. Ethan sat quietly, his small body still tense, but there was something new in his eyes, relief. For the first time since they had noticed him, he no longer looked like he was trying to disappear. The flight attendant stayed by his side, speaking to him softly, reassuring him that he was safe now. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the thought. Who was the man who had put Ethan on this plane? And more importantly, where was he now? The officers led Ethan off the plane first, keeping him close, shielding him from the curious glances of passengers who were still whispering about what had just unfolded. The man who had claimed to be his uncle was already in custody, his face cold and unreadable as he was placed into the back of a police car. He didn't struggle. He didn't protest. That was what made it all the more chilling. He wasn't surprised. As Ethan stepped onto the tarmac, an officer crouched beside him, speaking gently. "Ethan, do you remember anything about the man who brought you to the airport? What he looked like? Anything you can tell us will help." Ethan hesitated. Then slowly, he nodded. "He wore a hat," he whispered, "and sunglasses. He didn't talk much. Just told me to stay quiet and do what I was told." The officers exchanged a glance with his partner. "Did he say where you were going?" Ethan bit his lip. "No, he just said I'd meet someone on the plane." His voice grew quieter. and that I had to act like I knew him. The officer's jaw tightened. They had suspected it, but now they knew for certain. Ethan had been placed on this flight intentionally. This was organized. Within minutes, more officers arrived, spreading through the airport, reviewing security footage, asking questions. The flight crew remained behind, watching as Ethan was escorted into a police vehicle. The lead flight attendant placed a hand over her heart, exhaling shakily. "I don't even want to think about what could have happened if we hadn't noticed," she murmured. The captain, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "You did notice. That's what matters." Hours later, as the investigation unfolded, the truth came to light. The man on the plane had been waiting for Ethan, but he wasn't working alone. The person who had brought Ethan to the airport had vanished before authorities could track him down. And worse, this wasn't an isolated case. The officers revealed that Ethan's situation fit the pattern of an ongoing investigation, one that reached far beyond a single flight. But Ethan was safe. That was what mattered now. Days later, news broke about the flight crew's actions. People called them heroes, but they didn't see it that way. They had simply trusted their instincts, acted when something didn't feel right, and because of that, Ethan was no longer lost in the shadows of an unimaginable fate. As the sun set over the airport that evening, the flight attendant sat by her window, sipping her tea, still thinking about the boy with the two big shoes and the quiet plea in his voice. She hoped he was somewhere safe now, surrounded by people who truly cared for him. And though she knew she might never see him again, she knew one thing for certain: she would never ignore a strange feeling again. Because sometimes, noticing the smallest details could change everything.